In January 1918, Russia no longer had an army. Just 3 years earlier, the Russian Empire had fielded one of the largest military forces on the planet. Millions of men under arms, stretched across a front that ran from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea. By the winter of 1918, that entire structure had simply come apart. Soldiers were deserting by the thousands every single week. Officers were being executed by their own men in the streets, or quietly slipping away in civilian clothes to save their lives. The front line against Germany, once a fortified wall of trenches and artillery, had become a hollow shell, undefended and abandoned in long stretches. It was into this vacuum of violence, hunger, and total institutional collapse that a former journalist, prison inmate, and revolutionary agitator named Leon Trotsky was handed one of the most difficult assignments in modern military history. Build, from almost nothing, a fighting force capable of defending a fragile new government under attack from every direction at once. What emerged from his efforts over the following months would become the Red Army, formerly titled the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, an institution that would go on to shape the next 7 decades of global history, and whose birth, in many ways, was every bit as chaotic and violent as the war it was created to fight. To really understand how Russia arrived at this point of total military collapse, we have to rewind slightly to the final, exhausting years of the First World War. By 1917, that war had already bled the Russian army white. Casualties numbered in the millions. Supply lines meant to feed and arm soldiers at the front routinely failed, leaving men without boots, without rifles, sometimes without food for days. Morale, understandably, had cratered. Soldiers at the front, many of them peasants conscripted straight off the land, had grown deeply disillusioned with a war that increasingly seemed to serve only the interests of the aristocracy and the officer class, while they froze in trenches for a cause they barely understood. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October of 1917, one of their very first acts as a government was Lenin's decree on peace, an open, public call to end Russia's involvement in the war immediately and unconditionally. This single decree accelerated a process that was, in truth, already well underway across the front. Informal fraternization between Russian and German soldiers across no man's land, spontaneous local ceasefires negotiated soldier to soldier, and a mass, uncoordinated exodus of peasant conscripts who simply began walking home. Rifles slung over their shoulders, determined to reclaim land that was, at that very moment, being redistributed in their absence by revolutionary land committees. Compounding this collapse was a political decision that had actually been made even before the Bolsheviks came to power. Order Number 1, issued by the Petrograd Soviet back in March of 1917, in the earliest days of the revolution, had stripped officers of much of their traditional authority over their men, placing military units instead under the control of elected soldiers' committees. The intention behind it was to democratize a deeply hierarchical, often abusive institution that had, for generations, treated common soldiers as expendable. But its practical effect on military discipline, especially once combined with war weariness and revolutionary agitation, was nothing short of catastrophic. By the winter of 1918, the imperial military machine that had fought for more than 3 brutal years against both Germany and Austria-Hungary had, for all practical purposes, simply ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. There was no army left standing to defend the revolution, at the exact historical moment the revolution needed defending most desperately. This was the impossible problem placed squarely on Trotsky's shoulders the moment he was appointed Commissar of War. He had no military background whatsoever himself. His skills lay in organization, in propaganda, in the cold, ruthless logic of political survival. But he understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the new Bolshevik leadership, that ideology alone would not win battles. His first major decision was as pragmatic as it was deeply controversial within his own revolutionary party. He began actively recruiting thousands of former Tsarist officers, men who had spent their entire professional career serving the very empire the Bolsheviks had just violently overthrown. These so-called military specialists brought exactly the kind of professional expertise, logistics knowledge, and tactical training that the revolution desperately lacked and could not simply invent overnight. But their loyalty to the new Soviet state was, understandably, deeply suspect to hardline revolutionaries. Trotsky's solution to this trust problem was to attach political commissars to every single military unit, officers whose job was not to command troops in battle, but rather to watch over the former Tsarist specialists at all times, enforce ideological discipline among the ranks, and report back immediately at the first sign of hesitation, incompetence, or outright betrayal. It was an uneasy, often tense compromise between military necessity and revolutionary paranoia, but crucially, It worked well enough to actually get a functioning army into the field within months. Trotsky himself became something of a legend during this period for his relentless use of a personal armored train, which functioned as a mobile headquarters and command center, complete with a printing press, a telegraph office, and even a small cavalry escort. He crisscrossed the collapsing, war-damaged Russian rail network on this train for most of the Civil War, appearing suddenly and unannounced at crumbling, panicked fronts, delivering fiery, theatrical speeches to demoralized and often terrified troops, personally ordering the execution of deserters and cowards to restore basic discipline, and rushing desperately needed reinforcements to whichever crisis happened to be most urgent that particular week. What had started, in the very early months of 1918, as a scattered, loosely organized volunteer militia was, within a remarkably short span of time, transformed by compulsory conscription into a genuine mass conscript army, because it had become brutally clear almost immediately that volunteers alone, however enthusiastic, would never be sufficient to fight the vast, multi-front war that was already beginning to unfold across the former empire. And that war was fought on a scale that is genuinely difficult to overstate, even today. The White Movement, as it came to be broadly called by historians, was never a single, unified army under one central command. It was instead a loose, often uncoordinated patchwork of separate, geographically isolated forces, spread across an almost impossibly vast territory that stretched from the borders of Europe all the way to the Pacific coast. In the south, General Anton Denikin commanded forces that would, at their peak, push deep through Ukraine and threaten the very heart of Bolshevik-controlled Russia. In Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler of Russia, commanding armies scattered across thousands of miles along the Trans-Siberian Railway, the single fragile artery connecting his forces together. Near Petrograd itself, General Yudenich launched a rapid offensive that, at one terrifying point, came within artillery range of the city's outskirts. And foreign nations added yet another layer of complexity to this already chaotic picture. British, French, Japanese, and American troops all intervened at various points during the conflict, supplying weapons, funding, and in some cases combat troops directly to support the anti-Bolshevik cause, driven partly by ideological hostility to communism, and partly by a practical desire to keep stockpiled Allied war material from falling into either German or Bolshevik hands. But out of this brutal, chaotic, almost impossibly violent birth came an institution that would endure in one form or another for the rest of the century. The Red Army, hastily assembled under genuine emergency conditions by a man with absolutely no formal military training of his own, built through mass conscription, borrowed imperial expertise, and relentless ideological enforcement, would become the enduring foundation of Soviet military power for generations to come. It would be reorganized, purged, re-equipped, and reimagined many times over across the following decades, but its fundamental origins would always trace directly back to these desperate, formative years between 1918 and 1922. In the next episode, we'll follow this newly born army forward 2 full decades in time, to see exactly how it would go on to develop the single weapon that would come to define its battlefield reputation for the rest of the 20th century, the T-34 tank. But out of this brutal, chaotic, almost impossibly violent birth came an institution that would endure in one form or another for the rest of the century. The Red Army, hastily assembled under genuine emergency conditions by a man with absolutely no formal military training of his own, built through mass conscription, borrowed imperial expertise, and relentless ideological enforcement, would become the enduring foundation of Soviet military power for generations to come. It would be reorganized, purged, re-equipped, and reimagined many times over across the following decades,